Hello guys, I'm Stephen Lubo from S5BCom A and today I'll be talking about the Bhopal gas tragedy. The Bhopal gas tragedy was a chemical accident on the night of 2nd and 3rd December 1984 at Union Carbide India Limited pesticide plant in Bhopal, Madhya Pradesh. The industrial disaster is considered the world's worst in history. Over 500,000 people were exposed to methyl isocyanate (MIC) gas. This gas is responsible for taking the lives of more than 15,000 and injuring almost half a million people. Methyl isocyanate is a colorless, poisonous, flammable liquid that is an intermediate chemical in the production of carbamide pesticides such as carbyle, carbofuran, methomyl, and aldica. It's also been used in the production of rubbers and adhesives. It is an extremely toxic and irritating compound and it's very hazardous to human health. How did the methyl isocyanate leak? Union Carbide's India's Bhopal facility housed three 68,000-liter liquid MIC storage tanks, E610, E611, and E619. Months before the tragedy, MIC production was in progress and was being filled in the tanks. No tank was allowed to be filled more than 50% of its capacity, and the tank was pressurized with inert nitrogen gas. Pressurization allowed liquid MIC to be pumped out of each tank. However, one of the tanks, E610, lost the ability to contain nitrogen gas pressure, hence liquid MIC could not be pumped out of it. As per the rules, each of the tanks could not be filled with more than 30 tons of liquid MIC, but this tank had 42 tons. This failure forced this failure forced UCIL to halt methyl isocyanate production in Bhopal and the plant was partly shut down for maintenance. An attempt was made to make the defective tank functional again on December 1. However, the attempt failed. By then, most of the plant's methyl isocyanate related safety systems were malfunctioning. According to reports, by December 2nd eve, water had entered the malfunctioning tank, which caused an exothermic reaction resulting in the gas tank to explode and all the gas to escape in the atmosphere. The pressure in the tank increased 5 times by night. By midnight, the workers in the MIC area started feeling the effects of the MIC gas. The decision to address the leak was to be made a couple of minutes later. However, by then the chemical reaction in the tank had reached a critical stage. About 30 tons of MIC escaped from the tank into the atmosphere within an hour. Most Bhopal residents were made aware of the gas leak by exposure to the gas itself. Impact of methyl isocyanate leak. Doctors were not aware of the proper treatment methods for this incident. Methyl isocyanate gas leak killed more than 15,000 people and affected over 600,000 workers. The stillbirth rate and the neonatal mortality rate increased up to 300% and 200% respectively. The gas leak impacted trees and animals too. Within a couple of days, trees in the nearby area became barren. Bloated animal carcasses had to be disposed of. People ran on the streets, vomiting and dying. The situation was so bad that the city ran out of cremation grounds. Studied and reported long-term health effects are, for the eyes, chronic conjunctivitis, scars on the cornea, corneal opacities, earlier cataracts. For the respiratory tracts, obstructive and or restrictive disease, pulmonary fibrosis, aggravation of tuberculosis and chronic bronchitis. Neurological system, impairment of memory, finer motor skills, numbness, etc. Psychological problems, post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD). Children's health, peri and neonatal death rates increased, failure to grow, intellectual impairment, etc. The government's response to the Bhopal gas tragedy. UCIL was majority owned by the Union Carbide Corporation (UCC), with Indian government-controlled banks and the Indian public holding a 49.1% stake. Until then, the Indian government had never dealt with a disaster like this. Legal proceedings between India, UCC, and the US began right after the catastrophe. The government passed the Bhopal Gas Leak Act in March 1985, which allowed it to act as the legal representative for victims. While the UCC initially offered a 5 million relief fund to India, the government turned down the offer and demanded $3.3 billion. Eventually, an out-of-court settlement was reached on February of 1989 Union Carbide agreed to pay $470 million for the damages caused. The Supreme Court of India also laid down guidelines for the money. The family of the dead were to be given rupees 1 lakh to 3 lakh. In addition, fully or partially disabled were to get rupees 50,000 to 5 lakh, and those with a temporary injury rupees 25,000 to 1 lakh. The Apex Court asked UCIL to voluntarily fund a hospital in Bhopal to treat victims of the tragedy. In June 2010, seven former employees of UCIL, who were all Indian nationals, were convicted of causing death by negligence and sentenced to 2 years of imprisonment. However, they were later released on bail. UCC chairman and CEO Warren Anderson was arrested and released on bail by the Madhya Pradesh police in Bhopal on 7 December 1984. Anderson was taken to UCC's house, after which he was released 6 hours later on $2,100 bail and flown out of the government plane. These actions were allegedly taken under the direction of the Chief Secretary of the State, who was possibly instructed by the Chief Minister's office, who himself flew out of Bhopal immediately. Later in 1987, the Indian government summoned Anderson, eight other executives, and two company affiliates to appear in Indian court on homicide charges. In response, Union Carbide said the company is not under Indian jurisdiction. As of 2014, Dow is a named respondent in the number of ongoing cases arising from Union Carbide's business in Bhopal. Bhopal after 3 decades of the tragedy. As the legal battles were on in India and the US, Dow Chemical Company successfully took over the UCC in 2001, after which it became a wholly owned subsidiary. Thereafter, Dow claimed that the UCC did not have any responsibility towards the tragedy, as it was a legally new company with new ownership. Ingrid Eckerman, in his book The Bhopal Saga, recalls what a victim told him. Death would have been a great relief. It's worse to be a survivor. 30 years later, there is no closure in the case. Thousands of survivors of the Bhopal gas tragedy continue to face a lack of healthcare facilities. After the factory was closed, whatever remained inside was sealed and kept there. Gas victims' welfare organizations have been demanding its removal for years. Many petitions have been lying in the High Court and the Supreme Court for the removal of the plant's poisonous remains. Let's talk about the ultimate question: what caused the disaster? There are two main lines of argument involving the disaster: the corporate negligence. This point of view argues that the disaster was caused by a potent combination of under-maintained and decaying facilities, a weak attitude towards safety, and an under-trained workforce, culminating in worker actions that inadvertently enabled water to penetrate the MIC tanks in the absence of properly working safeguards. The worker sabotage. This point of view, held by the Union Carbide, argues that it was not physically possible for the water to enter the tank without concerted human effort, and that extensive testimony and engineering analysis leads to a conclusion that water entered the tank when a rogue individual hooked a water hose directly to an empty valve on the side of the tank. This point of view further argues that the Indian government took extensive actions to hide this possibility and in order to attach blame to UCC. What did we learn from this incident? Bhopal has taught us that every decision has a consequence. In the case of Bhopal, the decision to turn off the safety systems turned out to cause more destruction than it should have. Had the safety system been in working order, the leak would not have been as damaging. The second lesson that we learned is that the legal system does not always work to protect the victims. Bhopal has shown that sometimes corporations do not have to pay for the crimes they commit. The polluter does not always have to pay. The main lesson to be learned from the Bhopal gas disaster is about the dangers of the chemicals that we use every day. Now we know what the chemicals we use on a regular basis can do to our bodies and surroundings. The world had to learn the hard way how chemicals can harm future generations.